Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now we have a bit of a different kind of episode today. Different isn't necessarily bad. We have a special guest on. You may know him as Fashy Zizek. He's has a little bit of a Twitter presence himself. We've been talking to him, especially Percy has been talking to him for the last few months, and we're gonna get his take on a few things, and then we'll get into the news a little bit later in the show. But let's begin.
All right, thank you again, FZ, for coming on the show. I really appreciate this. We've been talking for a while now, and I've been picking your brain, and I think it's about time everybody else has to hear what you have to say.
Well,
And
no,
so,
it's my pleasure.
yeah, thank you, thank you. So, tell us a little bit about yourself before we go on. Like, what are some of your political persuasions? How did you get to this end of Twitter?
Um, all right. Well, I finished my undergraduate in politics and philosophy 3 years ago now, and so I was actually writing an honors thesis on Schmidt and liberalism. An honors thesis is like in the Anglo system, it's like a mini PhD in Australia, which is where I study. And so I don't know, I was just jumping into all of these weird forums and webzines that I never had any contact with, some neo-absolutist stuff, all of this, you could say it's not even budgeting alt-right, is it? It's like alt-right circa 2016. And yeah, so it kind of led me down a rabbit hole, considering things I hadn't considered before. But I generally say I've never been particularly predisposed to liberalism. My interests are in non-liberal philosophers, so Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Schmidt, Heidegger, people like this, and Dugin. I suppose you could throw that into the list, even though he's now a kind of meme in the alt-right. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from no particular ideological viewpoint, but definitely a non-liberal one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we all sort of share that backdrop. And I think it's a really interesting take to have because when you look at most international foreign policy or national security discussions, they are sort of coming from this liberal or neoliberal angle, even if it is being presented by the right. And so part of why I wanted to bring you onto this discussion is for you to sort of parse out some of what Dugan has recently been bringing up, and this is essentially an important conversation to have today because we are sort of we may be seeing either a decline or a pause in American power. And this is a sort of unique situation because we are dealing with a sort of transition period. And Dugan, he defines he uses these terms to try to capture what's going on. He uses terms such as hegemony, multipolarity, and unipolarity. And the main meanings, the purposes and the meanings of these terms is that, hegemony being a group, or it can be a singular, which would make it a unipolarity. And so my question to you right now is when you're looking at the world, do you see America still as the hegemon? And if it is the hegemon, is it is it plural with other states, or are we entering a stage of unipolarity with America where it does not have the same power relations with Europe or say Japan or others as it did before? And if so, what can you actually say we're actually in a multipolarity world? What is your take on what we're seeing right now in the world?
That's really nicely phrased. I have to say, I think there's a value to seeing ideological civilizational struggle in its place, but we shouldn't go overboard with it, as it were. Civilizations clash all the time, ideologies clash all the time, but no one really needs to pay too much attention to them. it's always human agents that wage wars, especially state agents, and they have very complicated interests. They have personal interests, they have national interests, and they have really developed social powers at their disposal. And one of the powers they have is they use ideology as a high-level conceptual tool. They use it like a tool. They use it like a weapon. And that's one way you can understand ideology. Now, to say that the US is a hegemon or that we live in a unipolar world is clearly to have an ideological point of view. But it also doesn't tell you nothing at all. It's not total bullshit. On the level of power alone, on the level of the ability to dominate world affairs, the US had hegemony, proper hegemony, I think, for that brief period in which it was the only country that could make, deliver, launch a nuclear weapon. It was the clear hegemon. It had an enormous military. Its entire economy was geared towards producing war material. It could invade almost anywhere on Earth that it wanted to, and it could obliterate almost anything it wanted to without retaliation of a kind. After that period, people had the power, especially the Soviets, had the power of retaliation. It wasn't so much a clear hegemony anymore. It was kind of a soft hegemony, or definitely. Does Krautheimer call this a bipolar system? Two powers or two power blocks, the US and the Soviets. Mm-hmm. In the 90s, you have this meme, of course, skipping forward, of the end of history, the unipolar world. That's really when this term gets going. And we should look at the 90s because the 90s are a really particular moment of interest. It's a moment of interest not because the US was a hegemon again, in the sense that it could wage war, it and its proxy partners in Western Europe, it could wage war on Iran, it could wage war on the collapsing Russia or the disintegrating Soviet Union, it could wage war on Russia and get away with it. Of course it couldn't. These powers, some of them had nuclear weapons, they still had enough military might to actually make such a thing difficult for the US. But this meme got going because the US had won an ideological war, more or less. Liberalism was the last Christian heresy left standing. It had defeated the second position, it had defeated the Soviet Union, and it had defeated fascism some 40 years before. So we were left, as it were, in this kind of golden moment for liberals in which they were kind of high on their own supply. They really believed, as it were, that this is it. This is the end. This is the end of conflict. From this point onward, it's either a smooth or a slightly rough journey towards a kind of American-led liberal global order. Who knows how that will end up? But it might end up with a world state. It might end up with the status quo, into eternity. But there's a way in which they really did believe this, even if we can just see in retrospect that it's fantastical. And for me, that has particular resonance because probably the most successful humanitarian intervention the US ever waged was in Yugoslavia in 1999, when the combined forces of the West really essentially invaded. They had a bombing campaign of the former Yugoslavia, of Serbia, in order to detach a part of its territory in the south. And they managed to bring this off with no deaths on their own side, no deaths among the Allied forces, and with, let's say, I'm going to make some people angry, but with a minimum of civilian casualties, definitely nothing like Iraq or Afghanistan, where up to 1 million people might have died.
Absolutely.
So Yugoslavia in 1999, it constitutes this perfect model. It's like it's what American liberals wish all humanitarian interventions could be. Totally successful. You walk away with no casualties on your side. It's quick. It's the public is in support of it. That's what they would really like the model of war to be like from then on. But of course, that's not what the model of war for the US has been like from then on. You have Afghanistan, you have Iraq, you have Syria, all quagmires in which the US enters, is in one way unable to really extract itself. It loses more men than the American public. There are more casualties than the American public is willing to accept. And I think it's really started to dawn on people, particularly the Europeans, the Western Europeans, that maybe this power, this hegemon, this unipower source of world order and world liberalism, maybe it's not as good at fighting wars and dominating world affairs as everyone thought. Maybe maybe liberals really were just high on their own supply. And so this is kind of leading to a reconsideration, I suppose, of world power. And that's one sense in which we can just see we both don't live in a real unipolar order, but we kind of also don't live in one in which people think there's a unipolar order anymore. Sometimes they still speak about it in that way, but it's not really true.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point with the humanitarian actions. Now, Zizek, he brings an interesting point up with this sort of decline of the unipolarity. As we discussed before, Zizek brings up the point that as the U.S. imperialism, as brutal as it has been, as it declines, something will fill its void. It's something that, in a sense, there has to be a hegemon, is what Zizek argues. And then he says that the hegemon that would replace the U.S. would necessarily be more brutal and more destructive than what the U.S. has been so far. Now, do you buy that argument that just because the U.S. no longer, or the West no longer colonizes Africa, that means that necessarily China or Russia will, or that they will necessarily be more brutal? Now, we know that it's happening, but is it really at the level of concern, or what is your take on the U.S. being sort of the best of the worst sort of hegemons?
I think we could definitely imagine something worse than U.S. hegemony. Maybe not many things worse, but we could imagine worse. It's not the worst system you could imagine. That said, it's pretty bad, and I want a way out. And I'm afraid that the way out isn't as simple as the kind of view that might predominate on the dissident right, the alt-right, this idea that we'll just return to a traditional world of nations having their limited wars, not self-determination, that's a liberal concept, but, state sovereignty, everyone has a state, these states fight each other in unideological ways, and this is essentially the way histories are going to turn. I don't think this is either a normative answer to the future, and I also don't think it's the way things are going to happen going forward. There's a certain point, you can blame Europeans for this, you can also thank Europeans for this. There's a certain point when the idea of the globe as a political concept is born. The idea of the world, the globe. Now, the Romans had a concept of the world. They were masters of the world. When they said they were masters of the world, they knew they didn't control every part of the land, of the surface of land that they knew about. Yet there was a self-contained globe within the orbit of Rome itself. But Europeans actually explored, mapped out the world, physically speaking. And after that point, the idea of global empire is born, and it's not going to die. It's not going to die. Imperial peoples like the Germans, like the Russians, like the Chinese, and so on, this idea has been born. They're not going to forget about it. The ideal of controlling the world, of being a true hegemon, is never, it's never going to fade from their minds. And they're the ones for whom this quixotic, also horrifying idea is in reach. They're the ones who can actually go about getting there. So I wouldn't say that I have any ideological commitment to multipolarity. This idea Dugin has, and others have had as well, that the world will be carved into spheres. There was a Huntingtonian thesis. Samuel Huntington has the idea of a world split into different civilizational blocks. All of this is fine so far as it goes, but if we live in a multipolar world, or if a multipolar world is coming, I think it's only the intermediate stage between now and something else. Another hegemony, another unipolarity. So it's a good way of saying this is where we're going, because it clearly is where we're going. As the United States collapses, as it recedes, as it weakens, it's not the case that anyone can cleanly step into its shoes and that there's no break, there's no fracture point. Of course there's a fracture point. Of course there's going to be war, there's going to be conflict. And there'll be multipolar poles of power. There'll be struggle along these poles. But ultimately where we end up is not multipolarity forever. I don't think so. I think at some point, one or other imperial entity will realize a kind of hegemony again.
Well, just to continue on that, I would say I think humanity's kind of destined to these ebbs and flows. Or there'll be one hegemon, one unipolarity, which will devolve into multipolarity, and so on and so forth, and just keep on repeating that cycle until civilization collapses and we die as a species. That's my view of it, at least.
Yeah, and I think FZ brings up a really interesting point that on the right, when we critique international politics and foreign relations, we do sort of do it from this uniquely Zionist perspective, because wars are what's bombastic. It makes the coverage. That's what we see on TV. But the reality of America's foreign policy and geopolitical strategy is in governing the sea powers by being able to control all the trade routes and sea routes that transports all the goods and oil, what have you, across the world. And this is actually known as Atlanticism. And we see that Atlanticism has been extremely important to all empires, whether the British or the Spanish, now the US. Naval power is extremely important. And so when looking at, even if Zionism recedes, let's say, or America's ability to wage war recedes, America still has this immense sea and trade route in its hands. And this is sort of the concern, though, of why this is where Iran sort of enters the picture. And last week's, antagonisms in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Because again, if the U.S. is not able to wage war, all that's left is their sea power. But right now, Iran is testing that sea route. So if Iran is able to break a sea route, now, the concept of Atlanticism and the U.S. naval power is going to start getting questioned as well. Now, I'm sure we all heard the news, British oil tankers getting taken, U.S. not quite responding as heavily as it could. Now, do you see this as, now I understand you're saying that this is going to be a transition period, these sort of conflicts is a transition period between another hegemon. But right now, who do you think would be able to step into some of those trade routes if it's broken by Iran? Do you see anyone being able to fill that void?
I think China is essentially there, but of course they're not there in the sense that they can secure all the trade routes by having a navy the size of the United States. The way that China will secure these trade routes is essentially through soft power, diplomacy, cultural pressure, through communities of their expats living in places, well, living everywhere. I mean, the tiny city that my mother hails from in Serbia, which is not, it's not the capital city. It already has a Chinese district. It has this street which is just full of new Chinese immigrants. Much like in the West, they have their traditional Chinese name and they have a Serbian name, and they speak Serbian, and it's not accented or anything. They're just the new arrivals. I think this is something that is happening practically everywhere. I think it kind of happens naturally in the sense that China struggles under the burden of a huge population, but it's also a political ploy. Of course it is. And China wouldn't secure something like global trade. It wouldn't secure the Straits of Hormuz by saying to the Iranians, if you try and blockade it, we'll bring in our navy and bomb you to shit or something, or we'll wage war on you. They'll say, look, we'll allow you to dominate the sphere close to you, or we'll build this entrepot for you. We'll build you a new port. We'll build you some new ships. Let's just, we'll just see what works. So in a sense, China is ready to step into the shoes of the United States. I'm not saying they wouldn't use hard power because they're too moral for it or something. I just think they have their very own way of ruling and of dominating affairs. Maybe they couldn't step into the shoes of the United States right now, but that's where they're pointing.
If I could just add something, you can see that the projection, say, of China, filling in the shoes, as it were, and let's say within a century of America becomes ever more difficult. And one of the reasons, ironically enough, is that which is, let's say, the strength of the West, the strength of America is also, at the moment, presently, its weakness. It's what's undermining it. And that thing is its multi-ethnicity, its multiracial character. In so much as America's able to project itself as a future world, right? The more multicultural it is, the more it can act as an alternative to the present day world, right? It becomes the world in the way that California is America future, America is world future, right? Now that's having a negative impact right now, right? And some of that impact is also is tied in with all kinds of other things that aren't, I think, directly as a result of that. That has to do with modern life and the Industrial Revolution and so on and so on. Those are bigger questions that are going to be there long after America's supremacy goes down a few notches, right? But you can see that China's almost racial uniformity. People can talk all they want about, all the various ethnicities, and there's dozens and dozens, right? From the outside, when we're talking about a country being a hegemon, however, they appear uniform, and with respect to, say, America, or with respect to, say, Britain or France, or even Germany. So this ability to rule, and it's a characteristic of all empires, right? It's the more they expand and the more territories that they gobble up, the more that the character, the internal character of the original nation state begins to change, and so a kind of resentment is a very strong possibility if a hegemon looks a very particular way and doesn't look another way. The more other they are, and the greater amount of power that they have, the less likely they are to achieve that. And this is why that's my own particular reason why I don't see a shift into a new unipolar world for a long. I mean, I do see it, but not for a long time. Until the characteristics of some of these countries changes, right? And those changes would be kind of like the things that many of us aren't at all very happy about now. So, I mean, that's basically the cycle that I see happening. But that's why I also don't see an immediate hegemon, definitely not in our lifetime, taking over. Not for a long time either, should they?
Yeah, I could agree with that. I mean, when I am kind of casting forward into the future, China is ready to consolidate a new trade system on the world island. They're building a series of ports and entrepôts in order to dominate trade, essentially from East Asia to Central Asia to the Middle East to Europe. They want to link it all together. This will have good and bad effects. It's an interesting thing. It has the potential to be really powerful. It definitely has the potential to bring them a great deal of influence. That said, I'm not saying in 10 years' time they just step into the role.
No, I didn't think that. I didn't think that. Yeah,
I think you're right. It could be 100 years. It could be 200 years. Who knows? I'm
glad you brought that up with China's expansion, if you will. And I know one of the topics we had planned was Zionism, Israel. Of course, we could talk about the American-Israeli relationship, but we covered actually a few months ago, actually almost a year ago at this point, increasing trade ties and, of course, Chinese access to Israeli ports. Do you think Israel will become the same thorn in China's side as it is in ours?
No. Strangely enough, I don't. I don't think they. First of all, I mean the power that Israel has in deliberative institutions and institutions of power in the U.S., the power that, say, Jewish people have as a group in cultural institutions,
which
really does hinge on this. Sure, it really does hinge on this kind of fetishism of the Jewish experience in Europe for thousands of years, culminating in the Holocaust, right? Which serves a very, very important mythic style. And by myth, I don't mean it's true or false. Myth just means what people say. So it serves this kind of as an educating myth for the modern day. It's a myth of liberalism, a central myth. And I think Europeans and Americans really buy into it in a way that no one else does, just because the experience is foreign to them. They might think certain things about it, but the Chinese certainly feel no guilt as regards this historical narrative. They might, they might see it as interesting, or they might feel certain things about it, but as it were, I think they're willing to treat Israel as just another power, just another power in the Middle East, and a nuclear power at that. I think they would work with the Israelis on a totally kind of objective, shall we say, footing. What can you offer us? What can we offer you? At the moment, of course, they do see them as intertwined with the United States, and in that sense, maybe they're wary of them. But yeah, in the future, I think.
What's funny is Mark Brauman actually has identified that Mount Sinai, the holiest mountain in Judaism, the term Sinai actually means China.
Yes, yes.
so I wouldn't put it past them, this whole 1,000-year experience. They may finagle something there with that connection. But speaking of culture too, I mean, you guys brought up the cultural element as well, with these liberal societies being more multiracial, and you look at America today, despite being a military power, it's sort of an empire in denial. We plant corporate flags around the world, not U.S. flags. So the American people have a hard time even seeing America as an empire because of this. It's sort of the illusion that American foreign policy presents. And my point being is that it seems that hegemony at its best, going back to, say, the Romans or the British, hegemony appears to be first and foremost a cultural phenomenon. That if you don't have a culture of power, you're not going to have a military that will be able to dominate. Now, America may have had this maybe up and until 2000, maybe 14, 2013. I think around then you see a lot of the liberal cultural take over America more so, and now you don't have this sort of like, there used to be this like, support the troops attitude everywhere you went in America. I mean, I remember during the Iraq War, it was just ridiculous. Everyone had a brother in the military. Everyone did. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so, but that has sort of been culturally sort of like wiped out. And so now looking at American hegemony, it's hard to be a hegemon if you culturally are in denial, don't you think?
I agree with. I want to agree with you, and I want to disagree with you. And I want to agree and say yes. It doesn't bode well for the United States that its population, first of all, can't really take casualties in large numbers, and it doesn't bode well that they kind of vacillate really violently between we want to be the foremost liberal power, and of course we should help these poor people who are at war or who are being exterminated or what have you. And then at the next moment, they elect someone like Trump based on entirely isolationistic sentiment. We just want to be our own little nation state over here. We don't want any stake in the rest of the world. We'll just trade with them and that's it. That doesn't bode well for the American empire. But then in a way, that's always been the case with America. There's always been this schizophrenia in the American soul or in the American psyche. The way I disagree is to say that capitalism capitalism provides for almost anything you need. So the American empire has a need to wage wars and to extend power, really, in a way that doesn't upset the balance of this kind of schizophrenia at home. And capitalism steps in and gives you all kinds of new technologies to do that. It gives you the television, which is a form of extending social or cultural power into even the homes of Indian and Afghan peasants. You can start to make them think the way Americans do, without ever actually bringing soldiers into their home. You have drones, which means you don't actually have to risk any American lives. You just send out a piece of military equipment. No one need know where it is. You just assassinate people from far away. You get more and more precise at doing it, and yeah, in a way, it's just it's amazing. It's something.
No.
It's something to admire, and it's something to be horrified by. But
Yeah, you bring
I
up a
don't.
really
Yeah.
great point. You bring up a really great point with how technology can sort of dehumanize or desensitize our feelings to war. And there's a really great book. I forget the author's name. It's called The Formations of Violence, and it basically talks about how this cultural connection to violence, how when people used to just fight physically, hand-to-hand combat, and how as the technology changed, the culture surrounding the violence also changes. And with drone technology, with the ability of possible AI soldiers, just full on robot warfare, yeah, it is possible that the American public, or just whoever it may be, is so desensitized, just so unaware of what's going on, because it is no longer human bodies waging the wars. It's like kitchen utensils. That is a horrific sight to think of. So now you have identified a really great point, and I think this is the point I've appreciated most from this conversation, that even if American hegemony is in decline, and we are sort of seeing a burgeoning multipolarity, that this is the transition period, that it is not going into a full multipolar world. It is going into another unipolar world. Now, the unipolar world that Dugin seems to be calling for in the fourth political theory is this sort of Eurasianism, where Russia is this essentially the hegemon, and this is a hegemony that's plural. It's through various state agencies and multiple state agencies, and chief among them is an institution that right now does exist, which is the EEU. It is sort of the Eurasian Economic Union. That right now doesn't have as many partners, but you are seeing an EU in decline, an EU in tumult. Brexit, Poland, Hungary, Italy. Um, do you see the EEU as an alternative to the EU?
This broader question of the Europe is my home, even if I didn't grow up there. I will return there at some point. The politics of Europe, the geopolitics of Europe, really interest me more than anything else. And although this organization, look, it's a way for Russia to regather its near abroad in a kind of post-Soviet Union. I don't mean to say that it'll have communist characteristics or anything like that, but it's just a way for Russia to dominate through soft means rather than hard means its borders and the bordering nations. I think the most interesting question is, let me put it this way. I think the most vital question to ask is not whether it's a viable structure as compared to the EU, because it's not the case, I think, as you pointed out, that Russia is some really strong power at the moment that's acting, that has the ability to be a hegemon. It's effectively surrounded. It's constantly fighting off color revolutions on its borders. It's fighting off independence movements and things like this. It's fighting off liberal cultural influence, you could say. And it's trying to find a kind of new place for itself in the world. That doesn't mean it's weak in the sense that, in the sense that Ukraine is weak or something like that, or that Switzerland is weak. It is a great power, but it's not yet in a place where it can act in a truly imperial manner. The way, what did you call it again? I know the full name of the organization, but the abbreviation. This Near Eastern Eurasianist collective of Russia.
The EU?
Yeah, this organization, I suppose it's modeled on the EU in a way, but what's striking about the EU is that I think the only way the EU is going to be relevant or survive is essentially if the Germans step up and dominate it, and find a way to make the French and the Italians and the Spanish accept this state of affairs. That's the only way the EU is going to stay together and go forward. And I think that would be a good thing, broadly speaking, because I think it would allow for Atlanticist power, as you say, Anglo-American power, to be cast off the continent, and for the considerations of the Americans and the British to be sidelined.
And that's a really interesting point you bring up, because for a lot of European states, they are sort of having this tough question where, think about like Hungary or Poland, where they did have to deal with Russia in World War II, and they don't like America, they don't like Russia, they don't like the EU. I mean, they like America, but you know what I mean, in the sense that they want to be a sovereign nation state. Yet, I fear that each option has its issues, right? And a lot of these European countries who want to go fully sovereign, I don't think they realize the implications of that. And I think Iran really proves that you need international partners to work with if you're going to try to challenge the system. Because Iran did try to go just pure nationalism, right? We will try to stay with ourselves. We'll take care of ourselves. You do your own thing, leave us alone, sort of thing. and obviously that led to 40 years of sanctions. You know, so it's I don't see you know, Italians or Hungarians who are wanting to break away from the EU, not wanting to work with the EEU, the Eurasian partners. I don't know that this third option is going to be a viable one either. And so, do you think that in a way Putin may have played his hand right? If he plays his hand right, that he could cast, if he casts Eurasian power as not communism, you see Putin financing Orthodox churches, you know, a lot. If this is something, if these are the sort of things that he continues, do you think um, these sort of Orban and Salvini and such, they will like that more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just kind of an obvious point. Anyone can see. Yes, the Italians are going to gravitate in a way to a kind of openly or tacitly Christian power compared to a power which tells them, no, you must start dismantling Catholic churches so that they can become youth centers for, you know, gay youth or something like that. You know, obviously they're not well disposed to someone who comes in and says the traditional Italian way of life, insofar as it still exists, is garbage and it's authoritarian and it has to be replaced by an American way of life. Of course, everyone in the West lives an American way of life. Everyone in the West lives an American way of life. And as you said about Hungary, my view on this is simply that the Hungarians don't have sovereignty. They don't have effective sovereignty, I'm sorry to say. You might have the trappings of sovereignty. You have a state, you have some options and some independence available to you. But I think sovereignty, I want to understand sovereignty in a more, not necessarily a rigid way, but a strong way. And if we understand it in a strong way, we can see there are probably a handful of peoples or nations or states in the world that currently have sovereignty. The US has a kind of sovereignty. China has a kind of sovereignty. Russia has a kind of sovereignty. Iran has a kind of sovereignty. So does, just because of how hermetically sealed it is, so does North Korea. Obviously, that doesn't mean all options are available to them equally. But being a nuclear power, particularly in the modern world, does give you something, gives you a way of acting, makes others relate to you in a way that's entirely different. Hungary can't stand by itself. Poland can't stand by itself. Italy, alas, can't stand by itself. They cannot combat China's rise economically. They couldn't combat Russia militarily, all else being equal. If they want to be safe, if they want to, you know, have a good standard of living and whatever, if they want to exercise power, it's either going to be through a larger corporate organizational empire, or it's going to be not at all. So, and in a way, look, I mean, the Italians are just naturally going to fall into a Western sphere. I think the Hungarians have more or less chosen where they'd prefer to be. And that is to say, they'd prefer to be in the Western sphere, but quibble with the particulars of it, which is to say, we want Western protection, we want American bases, we want to be a part of NATO, but at the same time, we don't want to set fire to Russian Orthodox churches or Hungarian churches for that matter. We don't want pride parades. We don't want an endless stream of migrants. And my commentary on that is just, look, that's all well and good for as long as it can last. But if you're part of an empire, it has the inertia. You don't have the inertia behind you. So your resistance is going to be continuously undercut, and it can't last forever.
I'll be honest.
Sorry. That's in a way why I think all of these imperial structures, you know, the West or the American hegemony in Europe, this is something that has to be undercut. This is something that has to be replaced in order for there to be change, in order for there to be movement. The status quo relies on not just American power or NATO, but the American form of life, liberalism, capitalism that comes packaged with this. And you can't, in a way, there's no opting in and out of certain elements. You can't say, oh, I'm going to have this and not going to have that. No, it's not a la carte. It's not cafeteria style imperialism. It's you're going to have it. You're going to have it all.
Now, I'll be honest, your take on Germany taking over the EU and forcing out the I guess the Anglo powers from the continent of Europe, that is a strategy I've not heard from the right wing. So that is pretty interesting. All right. Or do you guys have any other thoughts on this topic?
Well,
I have. Go ahead.
What you were just saying about you can't just opt in. It's you have all of it or you have none of it. That's a point we've been making for months with countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, even Turkey, where they want to bounce back and forth, where they want to cozy up to the Russians one day and then run back to the West the next. And that just really summarizes a point I've been trying to put out there for months that I've been trying to drill in people's heads. So, yeah, good job is what I'm saying.
Can I just quickly? Or sorry, did you
I just had one.
You wanted to ask a question?
Yeah. What do you think of? We were talking earlier about Atlantis ISM and Eurasianism. The Great World Island. What do you? You could broadly see the strategy of being worked out currently with Russia and China to circumvent the powers of the Atlantis by going literally right in the heart of the world island, and by rail is plane as well, but this ability to circumvent its power by remaining very far from the edges of the world island and going all the way from China to Europe. What do you think of, say, that Russia is, at the moment, you could say that Russia is useful for its military prowess as a way of securing this road, but also that in the sense that China isn't willing to demographically radically alter itself. I don't see that happening whatsoever, not for a very, very long time. Russia, do you see that Russia could also be utilized as a kind of frontman, a kind of less other face for China boring into, as it were, into Europe?
This is certainly true. But as it were, we're all frontmen, aren't we? We're all frontmen. If it doesn't really matter where you live, the American way of life penetrates you personally. It penetrates your community. It penetrates your state. The power of American capitalism and liberalism, you could say. And so I think you touch on a key point, which is that the Chinese and Russians together want a form of internal trade or consolidation, economic consolidation, that doesn't just rely on using the oceans, which is a good, it's a good tactic or a good strategic point as far as it goes. But more broadly speaking, I want to look at things geopolitically and say, everyone has a kind of suspicion of the US and of US power, hegemony, you could say, of their ability to control events on the world island. And though other powers at this point are to some extent ready, or will soon be ready to say, we don't want any more of this, the way that the US projects its power, first of all, into Europe is obviously through the West, and chiefly, as it were, has been through the UK or the English as a people, which is why I'm pretty happy about the prospect of them leaving the EU. I think this is a tremendously good thing. It won't be a good thing for the UK because it will make them less relevant. It'll give them less power. But ultimately, it's a good thing for the continent. the English or the British or what have you, they had one job, and that was to really put the foot forward for America and America's interest, to keep them in, to keep the Continentals, as it were, from getting too uppity or too anti-American in a way. And thankfully, their own internal logic, their egos in a way, their national ego has made them fail that. And now I'm really happy at the event that they're either leaving, or if they're not leaving, which is equally possible, if they're forced to go through another referendum and they stay, I still think that the Germans, the Russians, the Italians, I think they've had enough of them. I think they're going to manage things in Europe now in a way that essentially excludes the English as a power. Obviously, it's a nuclear power. It's a trading power. It's a financial power. It retains some of that. But as it were, even if they stay in the EU, the Germans are going to give them a cold shoulder, and the rest of Europe. I mean, how can you look on these people with anything but suspicion? Or at one moment you want to be in, the next moment you want to be out. Now you want to represent an American interest, now a European interest. You know, it's kind of another form of schizophrenia. The only way the world island really throws out American power for good is if it's thrown out on every front or at every angle. And so in this sense, the Germanization of the EU, or its transformation into a kind of German-led Western order in opposition to America, that's a good thing. I know why Frenchmen and so on wouldn't like this, but geopolitically speaking, it's a good thing.
Yeah, no, and by the way, I like that. I like agreeing. I do the same thing. I agree with certain things for all the wrong reasons. It's a lot of fun. But I just wanted to say one last thing. I promise. And it was your answer to my question. You brought up about, basically, I think you were touching on the idea that America still exerts such a tremendous soft power that is. The wars in and of themselves can be looked at separately. The pervasiveness of its culture is, has such a magnitude about it that in a way, they not only create, of course they had a hand in creating the physical architecture of modern life, but also its psychology. And the psychology of modern life has now become almost entirely theirs, and for the next great hegemon is going to have to have this interlink between this philosophy and this power to project itself in the future. That's not going to come. But here's an opportunity, I think, and this is my point, is that the absence of one overwhelming power that way, I suspect, will allow certain countries to begin to kind of tap into their own will to power. That is, it can become a kind of hibernating period for several countries or several regions, which include several countries, that are able, with an eye to the past, are able to reform a new kind of will to power, like a new. Do you know what I mean? Like, if American power decreases, say, in the physical world, right, but in the psychological world it still remains strong. I'm just arguing that over a certain period of time, the psychological power itself will also begin to decrease. The philosophies will be tainted. It won't be the kind of neoliberalism that your grandfather understood, and so on. And so there's a kind of opportunity in that a burgeoning hibernation period where a lot of these things for various amount of countries in Europe and in Central Asia can begin to speculate, right? Because it will allow them to have this kind of breathing space. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I agree with that.
All right. So just real quickly, what do you think about 2020? Do you think Trump's going to win?
Predictions. No, I don't think he's gonna win.
Hmm.
I don't think he's gonna win. I think this
I'm out.
question.
Good night.
This
I'm joking.
this question probably depends on who is facing, as it always does. I think I said on Twitter a few days ago, if he goes up against Bernie, or if he were to go up against Bernie, probably just like 2016, he'd get wrecked. I mean, Bernie would wipe the floor with him, mostly because a sizable part of the of let's say the Midwestern socialist-leaning white coalition he cobbled together would just go for Bernie because he seems more genuine in his socialism and in his old left sentiments. That said, I don't think Bernie's going to get the nomination. I don't think the Democrats are intelligent enough in a way to see what's in their interest, which is to give the reins to this old leftist, this old socialist. Yeah, I think it's going to be Kamala Harris or something. Just because she's the perfect confluence of identities. She's a kind of neoliberal Wonder Woman. She's not stupid. She's obviously an intelligent woman. She can dominate debates if she's well prepared, as we saw in the first Democratic debates. Yeah, I think if he goes up against her, it's a coin toss. It's coin toss.
So Trump in 2016, he said that he's neither Bush nor Obama, but I think what he meant was that he's actually Jimmy Carter. And what's interesting about Jimmy Carter too is Jimmy Carter was elected out on the eve of issues with Iran, and it was with the Ayatollah Khamenei. So Khamenei is already experienced with a president who is under pressure and election time's going to come up. Now, and Trump is he can get hit from two sides right now by the Democrats. He's neither making a deal, he's neither being effective militarily. And so he could easily be cast as, weak or unreasonable. But what has interestingly, come up, one of the most recent developments was that Rand Paul and Trump had been going golfing together, and apparently during these golf trips, Rand Paul was putting in a little word for himself to, hey, let me be the emissary. America does not have a ambassador to Iran. It hasn't had one since the last one was held hostage. So this Rand Paul was essentially asking for the same sort of position John Kerry had under Obama, to sort of just take lead on discussions with Iran. And Trump gave Rand Paul the red light, the green light on that. And Rand Paul and Javad Zarif did meet in New York City last week, and there was what appears to have sort of come from the situation was so Iran's offer was to have it will make a public statement that will officially declare that it will never build nuclear weapons. Now, this is kind of, as we've discussed before, nuclear weapons, it does have this sort of prestige, but in terms of Iran's geopolitical interests, it can achieve or it can achieve mutually assured destruction by other means with Israel without the use of nuclear weapons. So this has been sort of Iran's sort of trick, in the sense that they can get everyone to look and free. It's like waving your one hand up high while your other hand is stealing from their pocket or whatever. So while they're distracted with the hand waving, Iran has essentially built the largest ballistic stockpile. And so Javad Zarif has made this essential offer, that he'll give Trump the media win, the public win of having said that, he stopped Iran from getting nuclear weapons. They're willing to give him that for sanctions relief now, lifting all sanctions now. This is basically the situation the JCPOA had put the U.S. and Iran in originally. But Trump essentially wants the deal under his name, is what it's looking like. Now, do you guys think Trump will try to make a sort of deal with Iran before the election to try to avoid being Jimmy Carter?
I mean, I can see the appeal. To how many Americans will this appeal? I'm not certain. Trump can boast, that the economy is doing great, better than ever, and that I fixed the Iran issue and so on. Although it's hard to imagine. I mean, Israel effectively acts as if Iran already has nuclear weapons. That's the irony of it, and this goes to what you were saying, Perseus. So I'm not sure how successful it would be, but I can imagine it would definitely appeal to Trump. It would appeal to some of his voters for sure, and it would be good optics. Let's say it would be that, and a lot of Trump's presidency is hinged on optics, even if it's issues that people pretend to get inflamed about, because the way it's been cast in the media.
What do you think, Constantine? When I met you, you were an ardent libertarian. What do you think about Rand Paul right now?
Well, I can say Rand Paul, so long as you keep him diplomacy, foreign policy, I have absolutely no issue with him. But something may pan out, but I would say I don't think there's time to hammer out a comprehensive deal or even an optical victory before the election.
Yeah, good point.
I think Rand Paul is just trying to establish the libertarian to Iranian Nazi pipeline. Right, so we just move on to some of the news that we have?
I'll spend the last 10
Sure.
15 minutes here just closing out with some basic news topics. Just real quick, you guys won't be able to see it, but I'm going to pull a graphic here of the Ukrainian parliamentary elections, and in short, Zelensky's party swept the floor with it. The closest opposition, his party won 254 seats. Closest opposition, who called themselves the opposition platform, won 43 seats. So that's where it stands, and many have said, I tend to not disagree and not entirely agree either, that this pretty much solidifies Ukraine's path towards European integration.
Finally, Ukraine will be like Poland.
Which is what they've always wanted.
Yeah, I know. Ukrainians will now not have to strictly go to Poland to be mates. The world is their oyster at any moment now.
Yeah, but beyond that, as I've been discussing for the past few months, I think Zelensky, what he's going to do, he's either going to botch the situation, make it so much worse, or just be an inactive party as Ukraine continues on its path of, I guess, people fleeing it. Of course, ethnic tensions rising up there. So I don't see much changing. I don't think his election did much. But the biggest losers of the election were the Poroshenko's party, which I believe is the one right here in the purple, European Solidarity. So he decided to stick around in politics after being outed as president, and he continues to suffer losses. So at the very least, I can appreciate that.
I think
Yeah,
we
I mean,
all can.
go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think we all can appreciate it. Sorry, no, it's a private joke. I mean, yeah, this seems like this seems in a way like a nothing election. I mean, it is strange. It is strange, this spate of comedians and talk show hosts and personalities like Trump. You know, they find success in the US, obviously. They find success in the UK, in Italy, in the Ukraine now. It's just like, yeah, where does this end? I know people don't like establishment politicians, but I don't know if the correct response to that is to elect a comedian, you know?
Yeah, I think they're at their wits' end.
Yeah. They don't have very many options open to them at this point, the poor Ukrainians.
The obligatory reference to Ukraine being a joke country, so Zelensky's a fitting leader. Yeah, I've made it a million times at this point, but I just have to say it again. Beyond that, I did, of course, Boris Johnson in the UK won the UK Conservative leadership, and he's set to become Prime Minister within the next few days, point being very soon. So, we discussed this previously. He was a shoo-in. Everyone knew he was going to get it. His closest opponent, I believe, was actually Jeremy Hunt, who was trailing him. I believe when he was polling at 42%, Hunt was at like 14%, so it wasn't much of a thing. Now, the one thing I think, as we were discussing earlier, just in terms of this, Boris Johnson will be good on, is he's going to get the UK out of the EU in October. I firmly believe that. Now, whether that's with the deal, without a deal, who knows? But point being is, I think he's going to finally carry out the Brexit. I mean, we're past the 3-year anniversary of the initial vote already. I don't think someone like him, for all his faults, is going to get pressured into a second referendum or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add about Boris Johnson. If he does, does this mean he's going to get like a proper haircut? Is what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
very messy hair, that guy. I mean, he could take some tips from Trump. Both of them have slightly longish hair, and Trump's is immaculate. So,
may I say something about Boris?
Go ahead.
I think there's a possibility that he could just take the UK out of the EU. I think there's another possibility, which is that he just has way too many forces arrayed against him. Even in his own party, there are people who said they'll leave if he's elected, which I suppose they're going to leave. There are others who are saying that if he's elected, and the new stand they want to take is there must not be a no-deal Brexit under any circumstances. Anything would be better than a no deal. And so on this proposition that he would take the UK out with no deal, they should form a national unity government led by some respected Labour MP in order to ensure negotiations go forward. Boris Johnson is hated by the Scots or disliked by them, not without reason. And taking the UK out with no deal would be a real tragedy for Ireland. I think it would be more of a tragedy for the UK in the simple sense that I don't know if the Northern Irish, I don't know if any Irishman really wants that border to be a live point of dispute or conflict again, or a formal state border. I think his election as leader doesn't mean anything straightforward. I think it could go any number of ways. One of those ways is the continuing fragmentation of this internal union of the United Kingdom.
I would definitely agree with that one. Now, in terms of the last few news topics we got here, I want to get into... have you heard the news with Deutsche Bank and how a lot of people are speculating that it is going to go down because the story came out the other day. Now this is more in the alternative media circles from Zero Hedge, saying that quote, a bank with 49 trillion in derivative exposures is melting down before our eyes. And of course they cite how the massive layoffs they have. They go back to 2016 when the U.S. bailed them out, and they've gone over a string of their failures, and people are thinking maybe it's just the doomsdayers, that this is going to be the time where it's like, no more, oh, it's going to definitely collapse this time. What do you make of that?
I think this, assuming you're asking me.
Just in general,
I
but
think
go
that,
ahead.
I think that we're on the precipice of another slowdown or recession, or correction, as they euphemistically say in finance. There are signs of it everywhere. Everything is slowing down. I read some interesting analysis by an American economist saying America itself could already be in recession at the moment. It could already have entered a slow recession, and it just hasn't registered in the numbers yet. I think it's really possible that we're going to see a recession this fall, this American fall. If not this year, definitely next year.
We're due for one. We're coming up on the decade since the last one. We're actually past the decade since the 2008 collapse, not collapse, but recession, if you will. I think everyone out there gets the point. But I would definitely agree, and this may be the catalyst for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely it would be far-reaching because the Deutsche Bank, of course, has many tie-ins with the American banks and the American economy. It would be a major blow, and I would say that even if it was well contained, this is considering that Germany is an American client state. If it was just contained in Germany, right? If it was just a local catastrophe, this in and of itself would be a major concern for the U.S. Because this, in parallel with Brexit, would leave confidence in the EU during the popularity of populism in a very, very unsatisfactory state. It would be let's say the financial wing of a kind of ongoing problem with the EU and with the West in general. I mean, we've already seen the cultural one developing for some time now, but a financial one definitely would go far beyond Germany, to say nothing of Europe.
Absolutely. Now, one last story I want to close out on. It's been a year and a couple days since Trump and Putin met in Helsinki after last year's NATO summit, and everyone, the optimists on our side, if you will, declared it's the end of the Second Cold War. Trump has made peace with Russia. Our relations are going to improve, and all this kind of rhetoric. And I have to admit, I was a bit too optimistic myself. I didn't see this as the end of the U.S.-Russia Cold War, the Second Cold War. I didn't see this as some creation of some new alliance. But I was optimistic that we would at least continue on the right path, that we would at least continue on a path of de-escalation. But I mean, almost immediately afterwards, days afterwards, they were hammering Trump on Russian meddling, Russian interference. Oh, what do you think the intelligence agencies have to say about Russia and how they meddled in the election? Asking him these kind of things at the summit, where he's like, oh, no, I have faith in my good friend Vlad over here. That was pretty much Trump's response at the time. Then a few days later, of course, he recants on that. And then you get into October, the pullout of the INF, you get to the general state of U.S.-Russian relations today. And all I can say is, despite the fact that it was such a good meeting, such good optics, his press conference and photo op and handshake with Putin, I can only say U.S.-Russian relations have gotten worse. And point being is, that was an optical victory, if even.
Mm-hmm. The only way I would say that America will be happy with Russia is if it emulates Ukraine. And that's what was essentially supposed to happen in the 90s. That it was supposed to be the big Ukraine. It's completely out of the question, right? It's kind of like the issue with Iran. Iran can promise it'll never build a nuclear power. The problem, a nuclear weapon. The problem isn't whether Iran can have a nuclear weapon or not. The problem is that Iran's present power to begin with, right? That has to be leveled. Like, that's the problem. And Russia is in a similar kind of predicament. Like, if Russia was able to project its power and its sovereignty even without nuclear weapons, it would present the same problem for America, right? So, because it gets in the way of their hegemony, right? It gets in the way of their access to China. It's why America can never, ever leave Afghanistan. That's impossible. That will simply never happen. Like, America, the day America leaves Afghanistan is the day that America is going to be a very, very, very different country. And the reason for that is to keep Central Asia in check. And the reason for that is essentially Russia. Of course, Iran and China figure into it in a very great way. But, if you're going to make a one belt, one road a problem, you're going to have to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely.
I just want to give an update on the Aryan Anime Alliance. John Bolton had asked Japan to help the U.S. police the Strait of Hormuz, and Abe Shinzo politely declined.
Wow.
Oh, I can only imagine why.
Well, soon enough, the Japanese are not going to need terrestrial resources because they're going to be launching robots that mine asteroids for all kinds of things. So I think we're going to be living on a Japanese planet before long. About Trump, I have to say, I think pretty much everyone is sick of this guy. The only sense in which I can still say he's better than the alternatives is that he is a kind of destabilizing agent.
Yeah, he's a hellraiser.
Not in international geopolitics per se, but just because he's this kind of American archetype that Europeans hate. And so the one thing he's good for is making the Western European elite and middle class as well just totally disgusted and fed up, and drawing them away from America, as it were. That's the only way he's marginally good. The only other thing we can rely on him for is to be an total, absolute popularity whore.
Yeah, and he this kind of goes back to what you just said. But in terms of when it comes to a lot of the neoconservative stuff, he drags his heels. Look, he'll throw some missiles at Syria. He'll antagonize Iran, but I don't see him, at least in the coming years. Maybe in kind of a end of presidency special, he might do something, but I don't see him getting us involved in any major entanglements. Just because of, again, it probably goes back to, I don't want to affect my legacy. I don't want to look too unpopular. I don't want people to hate me. Going back to that sort of thing.
I mean, you could also argue that I love Trump for all the same reasons, Zizek. Which is why I also love Boris Johnson. It's for the chaos candidate, the chaos president. I mean, you can even see American intelligence is even unwilling to always disclose. I mean, not that this is hasn't been a feature with previous presidents, but certainly this is on another level we've probably never seen before. Just witness the last 2 years with Bolton, Pompeo, and others, their predecessors. Where you can tell they've obviously been told something by intelligence which has not been given to Trump. But they don't trust Trump with it, right? And this is, in my opinion, this is ideal. This is terrific. I hope he goes for 3 terms because they can't coordinate correctly, right? And this is an amazing scenario. It's everything I could have asked for. That's my humanitarian regime change. You know what? We didn't even need to bomb anybody.
But beyond that, I have no more news for the night. I have no more discussion topics. So, if you'd like to plug your platform, your Twitter, or anything else you would like to share, now's the time. I'll give the floor to you.
All right. Yeah. At the moment, because I'm basically writing a proposal for my Master of Philosophy, I have time to do nothing else but tweet. So, yeah, my handle is at Fashys Zizek, and follow me for hot takes of the kind you heard here. And yeah, I feel like I should write something longer, some essays or something like that, or post old essays of mine, but I haven't got around to it at all.
Hey, if you ever want to come back on the channel, have more discussions, particularly those, feel free. Just contact us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back.
Cheers. Thanks for having me on.
So
Yeah,
this
thank you
has
so
been
much.
this has been, I believe, episode 64. I hope I'm right there. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We had a great, rich discussion. I kind of took a back seat on, which I have to say I wasn't most well prepared for tonight. A little insider information there. But beyond that, wonderful discussion. Thank you everyone for showing up. Very nice operation we had tonight. And goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.